Elma Sands was 22 years old when she was murdered in New York City. Her body was thrown into the Manhattan Well on December 22nd, 1799. And this became a sensational story.
All defense lawyers, we're obsessed with crime and true crime. So this is like a 24/7 in our lives. And I just thought it was so interesting and so enlightening historically. I just really enjoyed the podcast. So thank you. And I think a lot of people out here who are defense lawyers are really into this. So
that's like really so good to hear, because I was hoping that the widest possible audience would be able to receive it, hence the kind of modernizing of the language and the specific kind of heightening and theatricalizing of the trial, because everything that I could research about it was already so theatrical, and it really was like about this performance. I had this idea of taking the scraps of the court transcripts, which really were these kind of biased, just note files, recorded by people who were already connected to those in power, and kind of transposing the language onto this modern context, because it feels like a trial that could happen today.
I will tell you, it's the first time as a long-time defense attorney who always roots for the underdog that I found myself actually as a defense lawyer rooting for the prosecution, because he was so ill-equipped to take the case. He was out-lawyered in many ways, and he was just so overwhelmed. So it was very interesting to hear that. So let me ask you about that. When you read the transcripts, what was it that made you feel that the government, in this case, the prosecutor, just was so overwhelmed?
Lisa, it's also so cringe just to even read it, because in his opening statement, he says in so many words to the jury, like, you guys, I'm set up for failure here. I have only circumstantial evidence. I've only had 4 days to prepare, whereas the defense attorneys have had 4 months to prepare. He knows that it's like going to be really hard.
But don't you think he was attempting to get sympathy on his side? I mean, that can
Totally.
be a great thing in a trial, is that you feel sorry for one side and you go with that side because you can see that it's not fair. And it seemed like that's what he was trying to do.
I think that's a great angle to interpret as well, because Goldwyn, the assistant district attorney who was the prosecutor on this, he was so much younger, and also I don't think he'd ever done a jury trial before. His career up until then was super admin based, and whereas Burr and Hamilton were there for the performance, Goldwyn was almost doing the opposite, kind of, as you're saying, appealing to the jurors' empathy. We don't know what the tone was, which is kind of the beauty of it too, because the primary document transcript that I used for my research was taken by someone who had tutored Philip Hamilton in French. So we know that Alexander Hamilton helped that guy get the job, like as the clerk. In the podcast, in the narration, I couldn't say enough. Again, Goldwyn is not included. Goldwyn's not going to be at the pub. He's not going to be at this meeting. He's not in the offices where Burr and Hamilton see each other every day. Goldwyn is on a totally different space, and he's left out of all these connections.
Well, what's so interesting though about that is that now that would be the defense lawyer who is left out of the boys club, who doesn't go to the same places. The defense lawyer who is in these, poorly resourced jurisdictions where there is no money and they don't know the judge. And so, now it seems like that has changed in many, many ways. It was surprising to hear that Burr and Hamilton were, part of this. I had no idea. I had to go back and listen to the song, and I go, oh, everybody's right. They did sing about it in Hamilton.
They don't mention Elma, which in itself is kind of what I'm saying. It's her name is not nothing about her story, and nothing about, again, Catherine Ring's action of putting the body on display, which set this entire thing in motion. It was inevitable that there would be a murder trial, but this happened during the yellow fever epidemic, which was part of my urgency to deliver the story during the pandemic and record it as an audio drama and kind of get it out as soon as I could, because it was just the whole thing started happening because of a quarantine. I mean, looking at the cause and effect of this entire story, Elma stayed home when the rest of the women and children in the house went upstate to quarantine and avoid the yellow fever because people were like dying in the streets. And during that time is when Elma was exposed to sexual violence by her uncle, and also when she started sleeping with Levi Weeks. And then the casual sex thing in the Quaker house is what kind of led to it all. And the whole thing felt so modern and just like interesting.
Why did you think that it was important to acknowledge the sexism back then and the marginalization of women's voices? I mean, what about that, other than obviously you're a woman and you're strong and you care about these issues now, but what about this particular case?
Part of it is that it was Catherine's bravery as a 27-year-old Quaker woman that set this whole thing in motion. I mean, she understood that to get any attention on this, she would have to mobilize the public. And she was expected to kind of bury her cousin's body and have these services. She was like a respected Quaker. And instead, she put her cousin's like battered corpse on display, getting people to come see it, getting people to put pressure on like, you know, the police, giant air quotes at the time, to make an arrest because people were, you know, scared. Like people were scared. People saw this like dead girl, and it wasn't like the people dead from the yellow fever that they had seen. This was someone who was like violently murdered. And then her continued fight as the first testifying witness in an American murder trial, like never having heard her name, but also not being able to find anything about her story or Elma's story that set in motion a system of justice that we have that's failing people the same way right now, 223 years later, but you have no idea. But I don't have that megaphone in real life. So it was just that question of like, if everyone was listening to me, like, what would I say and how would I tell it?
Right. Well, and it's such a great way to tell it, is in a story that is so intriguing like that has the heroines. I mean, it's really a testament to women's friendship and how, you know, her loyalty. So the cousin, and those of you who are going to listen, find out that she just was not going to let the death of her cousin go, and that no matter how they tried to shift blame or make her look awful or all the things they suggested during the trial, she was not going to let it go. And that was really a powerful impact, I think, of the story. So tell me about this. So, you know, you did the modern turn of phrases, and when I was first listening to it, it kind of caught me off because I remember thinking to myself, wait a minute, they wouldn't say that then. They wouldn't use that language. So what was the process of you making that decision?
Instead of like acting like I know exactly how people talk or trying to keep it close to this already kind of biased court record, I wanted to work from scratch and tell it in my voice. I think inevitably the writer's voice is going to show up in the story. So I choose to like embrace instead of like deny that. And the whole thing is like stranger than fiction. And I think trying to write it in more historically like accurate language, I was worried about, honestly, about alienating a potential audience. I want young people, I want anyone to be able to listen to this and to be entertained by it without having to do too much work to understand what anyone means, because there's so much hidden agenda. There are 75 witnesses. There are so many characters.
Well, that's what I want to ask you about. So first of all, how did you make the casting choices of which characters that you were going to profile in the podcast? How did you make those choices?
Many of them, to be completely honest with you, are like people I went to high school with or used to do theater with. I was able to really hire my friends for this, but part of that is because we had no idea the undertaking that we were about to embark on. Like, it was early 2021 and Allison and I were like, let's just record this. I mean, when I started talking to her about this, we knew very quickly that she would be an executive producer and would be Catherine, because we were both obsessed with Catherine. And we were like, well, let's just get this recorded and we'll just kind of like figure it out. Not beyond my wildest dreams in the world would I possibly have imagined Seth Meyers talking about Elma Sands and my show.
That's right.
Hearing Seth say her name was actually a bigger deal than hearing Seth say my name, because the effort of just like trying to get people to care about this and going from my friends at bars being like, can you not talk about this? Which obviously, bless them, I needed to take my efforts elsewhere.
Well, you hit it out of the park, because not only is it so popular, but I have to tell you, when I actually made a call to one of the actors because I was so angry. So Barry Scheck, who
I knew you
plays
were going to say
Ron,
Barry Scheck.
when I heard his voice, and I said, and the role that he played, I just disliked him so much. And I called him and I said, "You're being such an asshole. You sound so awful and mean. You're like the epitome of why people don't like defense lawyers." So he played a perfect role, because you really didn't like him. Even if you know Barry and love Barry, you didn't like the role that he played. So it was great.
I would like him to continue on that acting path. I mean, he and Tony Goldwyn are dear friends. And
it was
I
great.
know Tony and Barry both through the Innocence Project, which is also like I know through my dad, and his willingness to come into the studio and be this kind of like slimy Aaron Burr, but also to just be like cracking up with Tony on the side. The whole thing was just like beyond. And really this level of production, and then adding the narration kind of steadily and figuring out how much would be too much narration. All of that happened completely after. So really it was just the scripted material that was recorded in those 2 days.
You saying 2 days?
There were 2 in studio days. Yep. So we had like 20 people come in, and I have really been most comfortable directing like theater in the past. And I was adamant that the actors would be able to like act off each other, and that it wouldn't be like one person in a booth. And I think so much of us were just like craving at that point to make art with other people anyway. And so I am very grateful and pleased with the actors that I had come in.
Well, when you were setting up the defense lawyers, so with Barry and Goldwyn and your dad playing the judge, how did you prep them about how you wanted them to come across? I mean, was it your idea, or was it them reading the script and saying, "I'm going to be this kind of person"?
They're very talented and instinctual, but this, it took me a long time to write this because I wanted it to all match tonally. So it was already in like the words.
I was like, now I know your dad really wants to be a judge, because he seemed to really like being the boss in the courtroom.
He loved it. He was like, "Holden, sit down." And we'd be like, "Okay, we got it." And he'd be like, "No, I'm going to do it one more time. Colin, sit down." And he was like, "Wait, you couldn't, I feel like my teeth were weird. Let's run that back. Let's run that one more time." And he's literally saying the exact same way over and over. And he's never acted before. We have literally like Broadway actors in the room, and we're waiting for him to like, it was like so delightful, because it was just this incredible mix of like seasoned professionals, and then like my dad and Barry, who were like completely completely coming at this from a whole other wealth of experience.
Well, let me ask you this, because you talked about the court of public opinion and the fact that Catherine, her cousin, had actually displayed her battered body up in front of the house. For everybody to see. And that's obviously swaying court of public opinion. Do you think if the same case, same factual scenario, because honestly, you leave us with the impression of, and maybe this is me as a defense lawyer, was he guilty or not? I mean, you really don't know the answer.
I think largely it would not be different today. Levi, after having all these connections, after getting his like way and then getting to walk away, he then moves to Natchez, Mississippi, basically moving to a town where no one knows his name. Again, calling in a favor to his buddy Aaron Burr, who gets him his first job in Mississippi. That job is what leads him to build some key infrastructure for the town of Natchez, which leads them to create Levi Weeks Day, which is a holiday that celebrates it. And that's why in the first scene, in the first episode rather, when he and Elma are like in bed and she's like, "Ask me something, like just show interest in me, please, for a second, like ask me anything," and he's like, "Do you think they'll name a holiday after me?" I just put in like certain details like that, where it's like, wow, he literally got everything that he wanted because of money and connections to power. Whether it's the internet or like any sort of community where news travels and opinions form, I think is an incredibly powerful thing that can't be left out of the justice system. And I do think that any functional justice system has to impact the court of public opinion.
Well, when you talk about it, I think that you're so right on, Allison, but I wonder if, there's so many thousands of people in this country that are accused of crimes that nobody's ever heard of. Nobody follows in the newspaper. Nobody pays attention to. We learn now of people who have been sitting in jail for months and sometimes years, just waiting to have access to lawyers. And so it seems to me there are so many thousands and probably millions of people who never had public opinion count in their cases because the public didn't know that what was going on. But in high profile cases, I think it probably does matter. And we see the public weighing in a lot. I mean, in New York, one of your most recent cases, Sam Bankman-Fried, the crypto guy, the court of public opinion hated his guts before his trial, right?
Yes, I think that's such a great point. Once it's on the radar of the public and enough people are invested in it going a certain way, we're not prone to inaction. Like, we want to make our opinion known and make other people agree with us. I can't speak to what she wanted, but a complete failure of the justice system to acknowledge that this was a brutal murder, even though they had something like the coroner's jury already set up. The coroner's jury was supposed to be something that worked. And this group of guys who were not coroners gathered, more immediately after the body was found. And they said, this is a murder, but then that's disregarded. And then the doctor on the stand is able to change his opinion between the first day and the second day of the trial. And then it's all these loopholes that unraveled things that were already in place to kind of let the defense lawyers say, not only was this not my client, but this was probably not a murder at all. And nothing else counts besides what we say and the protocols that we're establishing. That erasure is something I'm concerned about because it is so resonant, and the system was set up to do exactly that. Burr and Hamilton walked away saying, we took the Constitution for a test drive, we won, so it works. So everything that we're doing works. And so today, when our system is bulldozing and erasing stories, it's the system working. It's what it was set up to do, it's doing now.
You talk about it in the podcast, and there are two things that really stuck out, and that is the forensic evidence. So you talked about the fact that they had a coroner's inquest in those days, and they weren't coroners, but they came to this decision about the death, which is kind of a grand jury thing that doesn't happen. It happens in Europe still, coroner's inquest, but they had made a decision that it had been a murder, and then how that was eroded over the course of the trial. And you had the government, the prosecutor called a doctor in who ended up being a dentist without any formal training. And, of course, the defense took him apart because he wasn't really a coroner or didn't have really any experience in pathology, is what it would be today. And so that was interesting to listen to, because here you had people that weren't even experts, and then you had no rules of evidence. The lawyers that listen to this are going to get frustrated because you could bring in testimony, written testimony that had not been cross-examined, or the other side had not had the opportunity to question the witness, but you could bring in the testimony where the judge was present when the written testimony occurred.
I think there was just this web of delusion and qualification amongst property owning white men who had all gone to the same schools and all kind of knew each other, where if you were David Hozak, the guy who founded Bellevue and who was ultimately the physician at the duel between Burr and Hamilton, is this legendary doctor who changed his mind overnight, whether you were David Hozak,
yes.
Exactly. Whether you were David Hozak or a friend of David Hozak, you were basically David Hozak. That's what I was getting from this. And this dentist truly does come up to the stand and he's like, I've read about autopsies. And so Colden's like, why not? This guy has something to say. He saw her. Right. That was the essence of the expert witness. It was the reputation and not the qualification.
Well, let me ask you something, Allison, now that you've done this and it's so successful and it's so interesting. You talk about women who were erased, and there's so many of them, and there's so many women of color who've been erased throughout time in the system. What's your next project? Are you going to continue along this women who were never heard about as victims? Tell us about that.
Elevating or retelling stories about women that have been completely bulldozed or sacrificed at the expense of, building the system, developing protocol. And that's what Allison and I are hoping to continue doing for subsequent seasons, adapting it for television, but also continuing in this radio play kind of audio drama medium. I have several ideas of stories for the next season. I will start by saying you're the first person I'm even like saying this aloud to. So the first woman to argue in the Supreme Court in DC was in the 1870s. I think she's the first Black female lawyer, Charlotte Ray. She was a defense lawyer in this case when she went to the Supreme Court. And in the 1870s, it was it was a woman petitioning for divorce, like from a husband who was extremely abusive. And it was like a really amazing case that she made for domestic abuse just in the 1870s as a Black woman in the Supreme Court. It's like so cool.
I know Charlotte Ray because she graduated from Howard Law School here in DC.
And I also would be remiss not to mention that through my work with Just Detention International, I got to do some like lobbying in DC a few months ago with Dee Farmer, who had her own Supreme Court case about sexual assault of trans people in prison. Yes. You know, and that's not an example of a case that's necessarily like erased, but her story was at risk of erasure. And then again, due to like her bravery taking it to the Supreme Court, certain legislation was passed. And then the same problem that she fought against continues to happen. So I have all these kind of right now acquaintances with real life heroes who would make such incredible subject matters. But then I also have this real passion for history and investigating a case that would otherwise be buried in the archives and bringing it to life.
I think the history part is really interesting in my opinion, but I'm a big history buff. So my dad was a history professor, and both my parents are from the South. So there were so many buried stories of that and just so many egregious things that have happened that it's just too much sometimes to even think about. So
yeah,
I think there's a lot there. I think the hardest part is being able to put it together. You know, I was shocked that there were transcripts. I had no idea, but that you had transcripts. I think a lot of these buried stories are courtrooms where there's no recording, no transcripts. Things just happened. People got lynched. People were there's just nothing there, right? It's just oral history. So that's a little bit tougher. But, you know, that's something to definitely think about. One of the big things that we are doing is actually along with FAM, is that we're going back and getting compassionate release for these women in Dublin prison who've been sexually assaulted by guards, and finally what's called a compassionate release motion to have their sentences reduced. And we're very into that. So if you want to connect and do all of that with your group, you know, that's something that we really have a really strong belief about, Allison. And, you know, that's why we're so excited to push the podcast out.
Thank you. I love that. And I do think that we probably intersect in many other realms. And I definitely feel like the most meaningful aspect of anything I do in the week is working with the incarcerated women in New York and leading these art groups, which are kind of currently in the process of expanding, and like getting art to incarcerated people, and any sort of healing and care practices is something I really care about. Compassionate release is something that my dad's been telling me about like since the dawn of time. Like, I am so glad to hear that those ladies in Dublin are going to get out. Anyone who's ever been a public defender, I feel like, is a hero, because the bravery to take on something that is set up to fail, and to every day wake up and know, like, I'm working against something that's broken out of a place of like compassion, knowing that the odds may be stacked against me. I'm just in awe of you guys. So I would love to connect about any and all other things that you're doing, and you're taking the time to talk about this and to listening to the podcast is extremely meaningful to me. I really appreciate it so much.
Well, thank you for taking the time. We really appreciate it.
I'm Allison Flom, and this is Erased, the Murder of Elma Sands. Are you ready?